Hi, I'm Yinka, and this is The Hurt Locker, a podcast where we open a door into men's mental health. Coming up,
I like to call myself a recovering academic.
I asked you at the beginning, how are you? And you're smiling now.
I'm not okay.
Let's dive in. You're listening to The Hurt Locker, a podcast that opens the door on men's mental health. And for tonight's guest, we have none other than James Brown. James, welcome to The Hurt Locker.
Hi, Inga. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I see, because of my ADHD, normal people will obviously just say, yeah, fine. But I felt like going into a 5-minute speech about exactly how difficult the last 6 weeks have been. But I think I'll go with, yeah, I'm fine, just in terms of how much less time it'll take.
Well, we will go wherever you want to go. For the benefit of our listeners and our viewers, tell us, who is James Brown?
So I like to call myself a recovering academic, in that I was a university researcher and lecturer for 20 years. And in, I think, February 2021, following a mental health crisis at the end of 2020, second lockdown, it was darker, it was much less fun for everybody. You know, a lot of serious stuff was going on, and I had a mental health crisis that culminated on Christmas Day, staring at the wall, very much having active ideation about not being here anymore. And that's what drove me to get a diagnosis of ADHD. And that then led me to change my entire career to be about ADHD, to be an ADHD coach, to set up a charity and a podcast and do neurodiversity training, and weirdly, things like advising the BBC on scripts. So now my whole career, my whole life is about supporting adults with ADHD and the associated mental health issues that we often have that come with ADHD.
Thank you. And we'll explore that hopefully in more detail. I asked you at the beginning, how are you? And you're smiling now. Let's dive in. How are you?
I'm not okay. I'm not okay at all, but that's okay. And that has to be, and always has been, my approach. I have a really complex set of issues, which isn't uncommon for adults with ADHD. So alongside my ADHD, I have a form of bipolar disorder called cyclothymia. And that means that relatively rapidly, almost monthly, I'll kind of go from hypomanic episode to kind of depressive episode, and also binge eating disorder, and a very rich and long history of substance use disorders. But the thing that I'm really struggling with, Yinka, is I have something called anhedonia. And anhedonia is the reduced ability to feel positive emotions. So what that means is that I don't really feel joy, excitement, happiness, being thrilled. My kind of standard feeling when I'm at my happiest, whatever happy is, that's the absence of fear and threat and danger. Kind of comfort is about as positive as I get. And this has had a real impact on me in the last, particularly 6 months, as I've tried to work out, well, what does life have for me? What are the things that are for me? I have a wife who I love very much, and we've changed and grown over the years, and it's got to the point in my life where there are so few things that I do that give me pleasure, that give me enjoyment, because I'm not using substances, and the only other things that really give me that sense of happiness, if that's what it is, because I don't really know what happiness is when I'm on stage giving talks, because I give public talks on ADHD, and that's because I'm probably a grown-up, childish rock star I want to be, that was desperate to have people love him and didn't. And then when I get off that stage, I'm just back to being completely flat, and it's exhausting, Yinka, to be honest, to see people having fun and to have conversations with your life partner, my wife, and we're very open and honest, and to tell her that on our wedding day I felt nothing, that on our honeymoon I felt nothing, that when we've been to some of our favorite holiday destinations, and she will say, have you seen the beautiful sunset there? And I'm thinking, yeah, seen it, what next? And it's very odd to have that as almost a driving force of how I interact with the world. And the reason I've been thinking so much about it, Yinka, is that my father passed away 2 years ago, and I am very much like him. And he was always called by my family a joyless man. It was not really a put down, but it was just the way they describe him. And he passed away at 91, and for the last probably 30 years of his life, he just sat in front of the television, flicking through the channels, occasionally watching, an old program, and had no hobbies, didn't really have any friends. And I can see myself going in that direction, that kind of isolation, that lack of interest. And that's been very much preoccupying my mind at a time when, other issues of life, financial issues and stuff like that is also there. And it got to December, actually, and I hit burnout, and I just couldn't work anymore for a few weeks. And during that time, and this has happened in the past, when I've taken time off, thinking, right, I'll take time off, get my head straight, things almost always get worse for me when I do that. When I take time off and actually just try and rest, then my mood absolutely dips. So Christmas Day I spent on my own, kind of just sat staring at the wall, which is not recommended. And it wasn't deliberate. It was just because I couldn't get up in time and kind of missed the boat. And so when I say I'm not okay, I'm not as bad as I've been. I'm not as good as I've been, but I'm definitely coming into 2025 trying to be positive, but mindful of the fact that there's a lot going on as I approach 50 that still worries me, I think.
What's your fears?
My biggest fear, if I'm honest, Yinka, is being alone, is being on my own. And my second biggest fear is, and this sounds awful because I adored my dad. He was the person I was closest to. My second biggest fear is turning into him. So being on my own is something I actually used to be able to handle better than I can now. But now, even if I spend kind of a day on my own, I'm fine for a few hours, but then eventually the inertia and the lack of things that I enjoy to do set in, and I'll end up sitting on the sofa, and then on my own with my thoughts, I can end up, being in a dark place. So I'm very lucky that I've got a partner. But should that ever, should the situation ever change in the future, I'm genuinely scared that I will end up being on my own. And that second fear of turning into my dad, like I say, as much as I loved him and still love him and still talk to him, that image of a man sat in front of the television whose family didn't really kind of respect him or give him much time, I can see so much of him in me, and I can see, even though I'm now desperately trying to change things, I can see it feels like that's my path, that I will end up as an anhedonic kind of joyless man who does like it when Mo Salah scores. I will say that as a Liverpool fan, but other than that, there's so little in life that gives me pleasure. It is a bit scary.
We'll return back to this. Let's go back to the beginning. What is ADHD?
It's a really good question.
Why do I ask that as a question? I ask that as a therapist who, admittedly, I can fumble along working with clients who come to me, who present, who say they may have traits of, they suspect, but they're unsure. And then they'll assign themselves, because it feels appropriate for them, that label of being neurodiverse. But break it down for me in terms of neurodiversity, ADHD, autism, etc. I'm asking a lot here. But
no, you're not.
This is an education.
It's actually not that complicated, Yinka. So the whole of society is neurodiverse. Everybody has a different brain with different abilities and thought patterns and memories and thinking skills. And one of the best comparisons is ADHD is at one end, of a behavioral spectrum. A little bit like being very tall is being at one end of a physical spectrum, being height. And therefore, the traits of ADHD do exist throughout the whole of society. If you look at the diagnostic symptoms for inattentiveness and hyperactivity, being forgetful, often losing things, making careless mistakes, everyone does that now and then. But with ADHD, because the brain has developed differently in the parts of the brain that regulate what we call executive function, so planning, organization, prioritization, self-monitoring, that type of stuff, what that means is that those symptoms are happening pretty much every day, and they're having a negative impact on our lives. To get diagnosed, the symptoms have to have a negative impact on at least 2 areas of your life. And that term neurodiverse or neurodivergent stems from the brain. So early on in life, from anywhere between 4 weeks post-conception to the first 2 or 3 years of life, as the human brain develops, and it normally takes about 25 to 30 years to develop, it just develops slightly differently. And there are poorer connections between some brain areas, and some brain areas are connected that really shouldn't be. And what that means is that difference in how the brain develops leads to a difference in our behaviors. The collateral damage of saying the traits of ADHD exist in society are that many people will say things like, yeah, but everyone's a bit ADHD. And I've heard that so often, which is kind of the same thing, but it's said in quite a diminishing tone by some people. What we know is, and it's not new, Yinka. The first scientific publication on ADHD was published in 1775 in a book in Germany, which was called Attention Deficit. I won't attempt the German pronunciation of that. And then Alexander Crichton wrote about it in 1798. And then there were children's books in the 19th century in Germany called Fidgety Phil, which were about a child that had ADHD. So we've known about it for years. But in this country, in the UK, you couldn't be diagnosed on the NHS as a child with ADHD till the year 2000. You couldn't be diagnosed on the NHS as an adult till the year 2008. And it wasn't until 2013 that you could be diagnosed with both ADHD and autism. Until then, if you had one, it excluded the diagnosis of the other. But what we actually know is 60% of people with autism have ADHD, and 40% of people with ADHD likely also have autism. And they're very different presentations, but they're both neurodevelopmental disorders which impacts the way in which we interact with the world and function on a day-to-day basis.
You don't realize you just opened up a can of worms for me. Seriously, from a purely professional and selfish, why is it taking so long for the UK, for Britain to play catch up?
I mean, that is...
For me, I'm kind of feeling both passionate and angry about that.
There are a few reasons, I think. First is if you look at the medical models of particularly the USA and Britain now, you and I, I'm sure when we were growing up, our awareness of ADHD, certainly mine, was naughty boys at school running around. You give them Ritalin, they can't. You give them Ritalin, they calm down, but it takes away their personality and they become robots. That's the reason because I suspected I had ADHD 6 years before I got diagnosed, and I avoided an assessment because I thought, yeah, but the medication will change me, which is ironic because I loathe myself. And that came from that kind of 1980s image of that's what ADHD is. Because our healthcare system has a very high boundary for evidence, if you like, and it's not driven by insurance companies where there is a financial bonus, if you like, of prescribing medication. In this country, we held back from pushing forward with it because it falls under psychiatry, which arguably it shouldn't, but there is a reason for that.
Okay, go on.
The reason is the fifth diagnostic criteria is no other psychiatric or neurodevelopmental disorder should more likely be causing your symptoms. And that's the only reason it falls under psychiatry, because it can present like borderline personality or extremely unstable personality disorder. It can present like bipolar. It can present like anxiety. And therefore, that differential diagnosis is the only reason it falls under psychiatry. And in 2013, Yinka, there was a poll in the British Medical Journal of psychiatrists, and it asked them a simple question: do you agree that adult ADHD is a valid diagnosis? And the majority voted no. That was in 2013. So you've got a branch of medicine in the UK that is in charge of assessing and diagnosing ADHD. And 11, 12 years ago, the majority of professionals in that medical sector didn't actually think it was a valid diagnosis.
Wouldn't it be fascinating to take that poll now?
It would. And I am lucky enough to know lots of psychiatrists through work and quite a few GPs. And some of the opinions that I've been told are shocking. I've heard a psychiatrist say, "Yeah, it's very trendy at the minute, isn't it?"
Oh,
and I've heard plenty of and seen plenty of kind of messages from primary care, from GPs as well. You can't have ADHD. You've got a degree or a successful career. And one person even I know was told, you sat still during a consultation, so you can't have ADHD. And part of the problem is that those GPs, and listen, I'm not bashing GPs, they do an incredible job. They're under-resourced and overworked. But when they did their training, their medical training, which could be 15 years ago, they would have probably had 1 or 2 hours on ADHD, and it would have told them this is a disorder of boys running around at school, and they grow out of it, which just isn't true. So we've got both an education and a healthcare system that are so far behind in terms of catching up with the reality of ADHD that it's going to take a while before we get to the point where people aren't waiting 7 years for an assessment.
That was a point I was going to go on to. More increasingly, I come across my peers who aren't therapists, just my peers, friends, etc., who have received a diagnosis in later life. And I'm seeing that increasingly so. When they've received that diagnosis, for a lot of them, for the majority of them, they've said it's been a relief. I have an understanding, I have an insight. Tim's just written now, having been diagnosed as an adult in 2021 or 35, I probably wouldn't have been diagnosed till 6 years after I left school and finished university in 2008. In a perverse way, that helps me grieve.
Yeah, it's powerful, isn't it? Yinka, the first time that I engaged with the healthcare service about what was my ADHD, I was 8. And this was in rural Shropshire, and the GP said to my mum, and I can still remember this, "He's hyperactive, Mrs. Brown, but don't worry, he'll grow out of it." And that was the kind of prevailing knowledge amongst GPs. But that was 1983, and of course, you couldn't get a diagnosis. And, if you look at the history of ADHD, and its names changing and the rules for diagnosing it changing, we are just starting to catch up with what we need to do with it. And the reason that so many people now in midlife or later life are getting a diagnosis is because somewhere between 2 and 5% of all adults have ADHD, which is a huge number. It's somewhere between kind of 1.5 and 3 million adults in the UK have ADHD. And more than 90% are undiagnosed. If you look at the number of prescriptions that are given for ADHD medication, it's 0.5% of the population. And whilst not everybody with ADHD takes ADHD medication, it's a good indicator of roughly how many people have the disorder. And what's happened since the pandemic and since the rise of social media platforms like TikTok and since people with celebrity announcing they've got ADHD is all of a sudden people who realized, oh, there's a name for me. There's a name for the things I struggle with and the things I do well and the challenges I've had. And there's a reason for the relationships and the jobs that maybe I left too soon, and for the other issues, the substance use, the anxiety, the coexisting mental health issues. People all of a sudden realize, oh, I can get help. And that's why we've got this, I think it's 700% was a figure I heard, increase in referrals for ADHD assessments, for which the NHS is absolutely not prepared, which is why we've got this situation of people waiting ages. And I'm currently on the NHS England ADHD task force, on one of the subgroups for experts by experience. And I'm really grateful to have that opportunity to try and help channel the views of our community into the NHS, because if you look at some of the statistics, the BBC did a really good piece for once on ADHD. And in Sheffield, for example, where there are over 6,600 people on the waiting list, in 2023, they did 3 assessments. And that is probably 2 days' work for a psychiatrist. 3 assessments in a year, and there are 6,500 people on that waiting list. It's shocking, isn't it?
I'm getting emotional now, thinking about the pain.
Yeah.
I know Tim's mentioned again in Leicestershire, there's a 5 to 6 year waiting list. I know in Liverpool, it's been up to 7 years waiting list. I worked with a client who was passed from pillar to post and had telephone assessments and then told that you haven't got it, you haven't got it. And it was heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Can I ask, how did you, 20 years an academic, you smiling. How did, okay, 20 years an academic.
Yeah.
My God, you must have been wearing various masks to get through all of that.
So day one, I have never been called James, apart from by my parents, until the first day of my PhD. I was called Bob, which is my dad's name, or Jim Bob, or Jim. And the first kind of senior academic professor to ask my name, I just said James, because I thought, well, that seems more clever, that seems more professional. And from that point, it was probably until about 5 years before I left academia, all about hiding who I am, sitting on my fingers in meetings so I don't end up kind of fidgeting, interrupting people all the time, really struggling with regulating my emotions, which is a part of ADHD that doesn't get spoken about enough. And it was really challenging. And the only reason I had any success, and I actually left academia 6 months before being made a professor, impulsively left academia. The only reason that I did well is because I really did it my own way, Yinka. So most scientists, particularly I was a biomedical scientist, will have one area of expertise. So they are a breast cancer specialist and they work on, one protein in breast epithelial cells, and they'll work on it for years. I jumped from subject to subject. I started off with diabetes, then went into cancer, and then went into obesity, and then went into exercise, and then aging, and then polycystic ovarian syndrome, because I get bored and then have an opportunity to do something else. Yeah, and go, okay, I can work with that person and get a couple of papers there, and then, but I'm bored of this. Now I'll do something else. So I was jumping from subject to subject and not becoming properly kind of expert in maybe in the eyes of academics in any one of them, because my brain was just telling me, do something new, find some reward. And equally, I'm not much of a finisher, which is common in ADHD. So therefore, seeing a subject through right to the end, it's so unrewarding. Whereas starting something new, bingo, thank you very much.
Somebody once described me as a Yinka. You love kicking off a football match, but you can't be there for the final whistle.
100%. If you wanted a nice metaphor for ADHD, that's absolutely spot on. And as somebody that started a national charity and left my wife to do most of the running of it, as somebody that's started so many different kind of ventures, I've run 3 charities. A homeless charity, an aging research charity, the ADHD charity that I run, and there are so many things. I've projects, guitars, hobbies where I've tried it in the past and then just almost immediately lost interest. I can see Tim's mentioned an incredible podcast that helps tens of thousands. I'd say a bang average podcast that probably helps about 12 people, but at the same time, that podcast opened the door for me to do everything that I'm doing now. But yeah, starter, not a finisher, big picture man, not a detail man. That's always been my approach to life. I can have great ideas, but handling the specifics and the nitty gritty.
The admin. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't do admin. What's the name of the podcast?
It's the ADHD Adults podcast. And it was really popular. We're self-destructive. The three hosts all have ADHD, and every time kind of we managed to get into a groove, something would happen. My mental health would dip, or Alex, my wife, Sam, Mrs. ADHD, she's also on the podcast. There'd be issues which would mean we'd take a break, but we've still got a nice little ardent group of followers who really kind of love what we do. And for me, it started out actually just as, I suppose, a hobby. It was just me and Alex at first. So Alex Connor was the person that told me I probably had ADHD back in about 2016. He phoned me up and said, I've just been diagnosed with ADHD and you're way more ADHD than I am. And we had a laugh, and I looked at all the tests online and they all screamed, yes, you've got it. And as I said, I thought, well, yeah, but they'll just give me medication and that will just, turn me into a, monotonous android. So I avoided dealing with it. But when I got diagnosed, we kind of immediately said, there's not much out there to support people with ADHD. There's American podcasts, American websites. They're not all evidence-based. And because we were both scientists with, between us, 40 years of experience in science, we wanted to do something that was evidence-based, because probably almost half of the stuff you see on social media about ADHD is not correct or is misleading. And the problem there is there are so many people that find out about it from social media or learn about it from social media.
Yes.
And therefore we just wanted to put something out there that wasn't glamorizing it, that wasn't demonizing it, but was authentic and honest and genuinely shared both evidence and our lived experience. And for me, it's been a therapeutic tool as well. The only episode I can remember the number of is 66, because we recorded it 2 days after my dad passed away. And I wanted to record it because one of the issues with ADHD is how we grieve, because we have issues with memory and forgetfulness. I didn't want to lose that feeling of grief, the feeling of loss that I had. I just wanted it recorded somewhere, because I was afraid that and this is what's happened, that give it a few weeks and months and I'd forget my dad existed until I saw a picture or, got reminded, and then all of a sudden it would come back. So it's allowed me to learn about myself. It's allowed me to learn about my wife, who's also autistic, and we didn't know that when we started the podcast. And it's been a really powerful, even if it was just for that, even if no one listened, it would have been worth it for me to learn more about myself and to understand the reasons that I've got the mental health issues that I've got, and the reasons that I have, dealt with life the way I've dealt with it for so long.
Do you still recall the grieving of your father?
Yeah. I made that a promise.
You paused.
Yeah. I paused because it's not very often I think about this and him. And you can probably already tell from my voice that it's immediately bringing up emotions that I haven't dealt with since I had the last therapy I had, which was internal family systems therapy,
Okay.
which really worked well for me with the things I wanted to deal with, low self-esteem and with dad. And my therapist, when we were talking about dad, said, why don't you write a letter to him? And this is something as an ADHD coach, I often get people to write a letter to themselves about things.
Yes.
And I thought, okay, I'll do that. And I wrote the letter. And as I wrote it, it was just a letter. And then I read it out and just exploded in tears. And all of that grief, all of that loss, all of that woe and sorrow came out when I read that letter. And I'm not a typical kind of man. I'm not particularly masculine. Crying is healthy. Emotions are healthy. I show my vulnerability to everybody. So it's not through fear of getting upset. I will probably cry at some point on this podcast, and I'm absolutely fine with that, because I want to be somebody who, when I am vulnerable and when I show my true self, if that helps one person, particularly men, because we are not the best at dealing with our emotions and opening up about these things. If it helps one person, then it's worth it. So the reason I paused was because I made Dad a promise. When he went about 10 weeks, he had a fall and he was 90, 91. So I'm an ex-nurse as well. The writing was on the wall. I could see it. So I had a bit of time to prepare emotionally. And in crisis mode, people with ADHD generally do quite well because you haven't really got to think about stuff. You've just got to do it.
Yes.
And I can remember as we got to the last few days when things started to get a bit distressing for Dad and we managed to get him sedated. And I can remember a couple of breakthrough periods where he woke up, and that's the bit that I still struggle with because I could see the fear in his eyes and he couldn't communicate. And all I could do was try and placate him. And when it got to the last night before he passed away and I was sat alone with him, I can remember just saying to him, it's okay. You can go. It's okay to go. You don't have to stay for me. You don't have to stay for anyone. And then he passed away the next day. And in terms of my relationship with him, I'm very, very lucky that because I have a social phobia, and that's largely around my family. So visiting my family is difficult. My wife would force me to have Dad over and stay with us every other week. And I love him to bits, but again, he was a joyless man who would sit in front of the television, clicking through the channels. And my wife's much better at engaging him in conversation. And I would be working and trying to sit with him and working. So I'd get very stressed out. But now I am so grateful that she did that. Because it meant for the last couple of years for his life, I got to see him and give him some love every couple of weeks. And the promise I made him was when he was scared that I will not leave your side. So I slept next to him every night for that last week and actually got into a fight with my family when somebody else wanted to. It was so important to me that I kept that promise and I stayed there right until he took that last breath.
Thank you for sharing.
Thanks.
I know you mentioned Anhedonia, and we'll come back to that in a bit. But talk to me about what love means to you and the ability to express it.
It's a really good question. And I don't think I have an answer for it. One of the vagaries of being neurodivergent is that many of us are alexithymic, and that means that we struggle to understand or describe our emotions and our moods and even physical feelings. And therefore, I know what love feels like. I know that feeling you get inside when you see the person that you love, when they make you laugh, when you know you're going to see them. But describing that feeling is so difficult for me. I've seen how other people love. I'm not sure I believe in the whole love language thing. I don't know, but I know that my mum, for example, definitely sees kind of money and gifts and supporting financially as showing love. For me, I try and I think show love. So I'm very tactile. If I know people are okay with hugs, I'm a hugger. I tell people I love them. Every male friend gets a kiss at the end of a WhatsApp message because I want them to know that I love them. It's really important to me that they know that I love them. But I couldn't tell you. If you asked me to write an essay on what love is, it'd be the shortest essay ever. It'd be 3 words. I don't know, or I'm not sure.
At the beginning, when you were talking about your fears of becoming, as your dad became known as, joyless, I started thinking about your relationship with your life partner and what that meant and what she has to tolerate and endure. You're looking down as I'm saying that.
You know what? You couldn't have asked that question at a better time, because particularly since my wife got diagnosed with autism, and I've really been trying to relearn who she is and understand who she is as a person. And lots of things make sense now about how we communicate, about how sometimes we don't communicate. But we both think we're a burden on the other. And whenever we get to our lowest point, so for Sam's really struggling at the minute. She's been off work for nearly 5 months with what we think is long COVID, but we're not sure. So her mental health, she's struggling with her mental health. And I'd had a migraine, which is, again, an ADHD thing. And I came downstairs to her bags packed, and she was going to leave for a bit because she thought we needed a break and because she thought she was a burden on me. And when I get to my darkest moments and I've got that passive ideation, those are the words. I'm a burden. She'd be better off without
yes,
me.
Absolutely.
And yet I ask her and she says, of course you're not. And, to me, she is my joy. So my joy is mined vicariously through my wife because she finds joy in the smallest things. If she sees a bee, then she just brightens up and is like, oh, look, it's a bee. Or if she sees a snail or a bird or a squirrel, or, the way in which her mind works as somebody, particularly with autism, even kind of inanimate objects like cars to her are non-gendered and they have personalities. And all of that's my joy, seeing her just take simple pleasure from things that to me are just, things, just objects or animals or plants. That's, I suppose, as close as I'll get to happiness. And it's challenging being in a relationship when one person's neurodivergent. It's more challenging when both are. And then when you add the coexisting mental health issues, I am difficult to live with, Inka, because in any month, I might have 5 migraines. I might have 7 days of suicidal ideation, very low mood. I might have issues with my back because I broke my back when I was younger, and it's challenging to live with someone who doesn't overtly show that they're happy much and has a lot of issues. But the one thing that we've got in common, really the strongest thing that binds us, is our sense of humor, is our ability to laugh at everything. We've got a very dark sense of humor. And I'll give you an example, and apologies to anybody that listens to this and thinks it's inappropriate, but this is how I deal with my mental health.
Go.
Back in May, I had a mental health crisis, and it's probably the 3rd one in 3 years. And I got to the point where I had taken an overdose 3 weeks before of tablets that you can't overdose on, which I thought you could. So I'd taken a handful of tablets and in the end just lay on the sofa feeling a bit sleepy. And then I realized, God, my wife was going to walk back into the house and see me like that. That's selfish. I couldn't ever do that. And about 3 weeks later, and this was, for me, it was a step up in the poor mental health because it was all subconscious. I was in the bath, and then before I knew it, I got out of the bath and I was packing a bag, and I was working out, where do I want to spend my last day or two? And I found a place, and I booked train tickets, and I packed my bag, and I was going. It was completely calm. There was no panic. There was no worry. There was just this sense of serenity that okay, this is what I'm doing. And very luckily, and I think this is a wonderful coping mechanism, I'd agreed with one friend who also has some mental health issues that we would have a channel where he's the only person I speak to. And if I ever got to that place, I would just tell him that I'm going to. He wouldn't try and stop me, but I would just tell him. And the act of messaging him, his name's Pat, he does the music for the podcast, saying, just let you know I'm thinking of doing this, just the act of doing that broke that spell. And I realized, okay, I'm not going to put the bag away or unpack it. I'm going to leave it there for a couple of days, but I'm not planning to go today. And then when I unpacked the bag, bear in mind that I'd gone on holiday to Lanzarote about 5 weeks before and only packed 2 pairs of pants for a week's trip because I'm not the best at packing with ADHD. For what was a suicide trip, I packed 6 pairs of pants. And this is what I love about this is this,
that's 3.5 weeks worth.
It is. This has turned in our little kind of community for the charity and for the podcast. This is now turned into a measure of mental health. As people will say how many pants there are. So people will say, "Well, I'm at 3 pants today," or I'm struggling. I'm at 4 pants. And for me, the fact that people who trust me enough to take a dark moment of my life and the humor I've used with it and use that for humor it's really important for me because I have to try and find humor in everything, in the darkest moments of my life, in the most challenging times, and therefore, therefore that's what binds me and my wife.
You just, again, I've mentioned this a couple of times in recent podcasts, but you just reminded me of Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. When he was in the concentration camp, it was laughter, it was gallows humor that got him through it.
It's a very powerful book, and it's something that we actually see in emergency services, and that people in emergency services have been disciplined for using that gallows humor, and yet there's lots of evidence that it's a coping strategy for dealing with traumatic experiences. I've seen cases of police officers who've been disciplined, suspended, lost their jobs for saying things on a WhatsApp group which were gallows humor, but it's a coping mechanism for many of us.
It's a coping mechanism. You know, I don't know. It's a separate conversation about gallows humor, and how then are we supposed to support people who are working on the front lines, who are experiencing those traumas vicariously or whatever, if they haven't got an outlet, a mechanism to manage what they are confronted with on a daily basis?
Yeah. I used to work with a colleague who was a diabetes specialist, but during the pandemic, it was all hands on deck. And when I chatted to him, I think it was after the first peak, and asked him how he was, had a check-in, he said, I'm really struggling. He said, every day I walked through that ward, I was scared it would be my last. I lost colleagues. I saw more people pass away than I've ever seen. And I said, well, what support are you getting? And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, surely there's some support for the healthcare professionals that have been to this. He says, no, we're not really being offered anything that's kind of strategic or systematic. It's just kind of dust yourself off, get on with it.
Do you have a website?
Yeah, so
an information website that we could share with people, because it's something for me that I'm going to listen to your podcast, but having that information there as well.
Yeah, the charity we set up is called ADHD Adult UK, all one word. And it's called that because co-founder Alex got the words the wrong way around when he registered the website domain. It was meant to be Adult ADHD UK. And the website is adhdadult.uk. And there are lots of resources, including explanations of ADHD, guides to how to get assessment through Right to Choose, how to get access to work, and lots of stuff on there to help people find out about what ADHD is.
Thank you. We're going to post that definitely. And I'm going to use it in a professional sense for myself and my practice. Can I ask, is it too early to ask you this question? But I'm asking anyway. Who's the most important person in your life?
My wife. By leagues and leagues and leagues.
And if I said to you that you're wrong, if I said to you that the most important person in your life is you know I'm going there.
Yeah.
How does that feel?
It feels challenging. And Yinka, that's something as a coach that I often use the oxygen mask analogy to people and say to them, listen, if you don't look after yourself, you can't look after the people you love. And I understand that cognitively. Accepting it emotionally is difficult. Partly because for many people with ADHD, particularly those of us that are late diagnosed, we go through 10, 20, 30, 40 years of feeling different, being told we're different, being rejected, struggling to fit in, having to mask, worrying that we're the only one. And it's very common to see low self-esteem and imposter syndrome and issues like that in ADHD. With myself, I've got to the point, and I think this is progress, and I think this is probably in terms of realistic progress the best I can do, and that's self-acceptance. I don't self-love. I think I would struggle with getting to the point of self-love, but I accept myself. I accept my flaws and my strengths. I accept my mistakes and my gifts. I accept everything about myself, including my neurodivergence. It is challenging to hear praise and to hear positive things, and it is challenging to myself at the center of the picture, but I am able to occasionally do that for example, when I'm struggling with my mental health and I need time off, but, you know, as a self-employed person, that's financially challenging, but I am able to say, no, it's more important that I do this now. And I think that's growth, because I wouldn't have been able to do that 5-6 years ago.
Going back to your dad, knowing what you did before he passed, was he fully aware of it? Was he proud of you? How was he with you?
Yeah. So very early on in the podcast, I decided that I would like my co-host to read out a letter from a Robert from Kidderminster, which is where he lived, every week. And every week Alex does, even since Dad passed. And he knew about this, and he loved it. And, you know, he would pose for pictures with a sign saying Alex is a cock, you know, my co-host, so we could put it on social media. When he was in hospital, listeners of the podcast all did a virtual get well soon card, and I printed it off and showed him that hundreds of people had sent messages saying to Robert from Kidderminster, hope you get well. Thank you so much for, you know, having James and et cetera, et cetera. So I think he was a bit confused by it, but he loved the fact that he was kind of tangentially involved in what I was doing. And kind of, other than my brother, probably the only person in my family that kind of really noticed or takes an interest in that. And for me, that was really important, because if anything that I've done wasn't for the good of people or for myself or for my wife, it's for him. Dad would always tell me how proud he was, would always tell me he loved me. There was never a deficit of that. But hearing that meant the world to me, and knowing that I would do anything when I got my PhD, you know, when I got my professorship, all of those things he found out about and was so proud, and he would be the first person I would tell.
Just close your eyes for a minute. Just have your time just now for a minute, please.
I miss him.
I don't hear that often, you know. I don't.
It's hard to, God, there you go. There come the tears. It's hard to express, you know, when you hear from people who talk about loss and they say, I'd give anything for 5 more minutes, or, you know, I think of the times when I could have seen that person and I didn't. And you hear these things and maybe don't pay them that much attention, but then when it's your reality, I would give everything I own and live on the streets for 5 more minutes with him, for one more hug.
I'm going to be naughty now. I'm going to ask you, if you had 5 minutes now with your dad, you can share if you want. What would you? You're smiling.
I'd tell him about Liverpool because he was a fan. I'd tell him about the cricket. I'd tell him about the boxing. I'd tell him that I loved him more than life, that he was my role model, that I can remember when he got made redundant in 1988 and got a paper round so he could buy us Christmas presents. He got made redundant in November. I know. And he was a die house worker. He wasn't well educated. So he didn't really have that many opportunities. Got a paper round just so he could buy me and my brother Christmas presents. I would tell him that I knew he loved me in my bones, and that he was my inspiration, my role model, and probably, and God, I hope my wife isn't listening to this, probably the person I've loved most in my life. And it's a different love to a partner, obviously.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. I didn't know where this was going to go. And, you know, there's so much to talk about here, about life itself. One of the things when I was at the university, you mentioned the stat that, 3 to 5% of individuals, or 1 to 5%, will receive a diagnosis or not, as the case may be. But a stat I heard when I was at the university was that of the students there, the cohorts, 17% of them had received a diagnosis, which I thought, compared to the general population, was massive. And it made me think, what ways are they able to navigate life to get into academia in the first place? But also, as well, as I'm thinking now, I'm thinking about some of the mature students I worked with and how being in that bubble of academia suited them more than anything else, because then they didn't have to go out and confront the everyday life and world. It was a great way to have a decent career, but also hide as well.
Well, absolutely. It's kind of interesting when you look at higher education and ADHD. Possibly most of students that have a diagnosis, it would have been an educational psychologist if it was diagnosed while they were at uni. And that means the NHS isn't interested in it. They won't accept that. You won't get medication for it, but it gives you dispensation at university. Absolutely. And that's powerful.
Yes.
And it's interesting because earlier on, right at the start, you talked about labels, and I've seen quite a lot recently online, people saying, we shouldn't label people with ADHD. Well, it's a lot better than the labels I gave myself for 40 years internally. I'd rather have that label than everything else I said. And if you look at, and this is why all of this is important, if you look at the statistics, and research is the past, and this doesn't have to be the future, but people with ADHD have lower quality of life on average, not everyone, are less likely to go into higher education or finish their higher education course. Not because we're less intelligent, but because universities aren't very good at supporting ADHD. If you look in the criminal justice system, so between 2 and 5% of adults have ADHD. In the prison system, it's 30.2% of males have ADHD. Wow. Exactly, undiagnosed.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. And we're doing nothing for these people. And particularly when you look at, so I'm very lucky to be, middle-aged, middle-class, slightly overweight white man. I've got the ability to stand on my platform and say stuff that other demographics can't. And for many of the people who end up in the criminal justice system who would have been or could have been diagnosed with ADHD as a child, you actually see that white boys generally tend to get pushed down the kind of the support through mental health services, and black boys tend to get pushed down the social services route. And we then create this prophecy for a person that has impulsivity, that has poor risk awareness, that's a people pleaser, to end up in a situation where they get involved in crime. And the really frustrating thing is, and the statistics go on, we're 5 times more likely to commit suicide. We are 3 times more likely to have an anxiety disorder, 5 times more likely to be bipolar. So many statistics I could throw at you about the difficult side of ADHD. But the key is, and the reason that I kind of do all this is, this can change. If you use medication just as one tool, and it's one of what should be a tool of 4 or 5 management approaches, in children, all their outcomes are improved: educational, employment, relationship, financial. And yet many parents, understandably, don't like the idea of medicating children. And actually many people in healthcare don't like the idea of medicating children, but the evidence shows it has better outcomes. And it's the same in adults. We know that things can change. So if you look at that prison statistic, it costs, I don't know, about £100,000 a year to keep somebody in a prison. Yes. The cheapest medication for ADHD in its cheapest form, which is 10 milligrams of methylphenidate quick release, is £2.80 a month. And even the expensive medications for ADHD are kind of £80 to £100 a month. And we know that if you actually give people in the criminal justice system, if they get diagnosed and medicated, their reoffending rate drops. It's a no-brainer, even if you were looking at it at a kind of financial, kind of cynical Tory way, and not an empathetic, moral way. And these are things that need to change, Yinka, because one of the issues that we've noticed is more women are coming forward for assessments now, which is brilliant, because women, the test for ADHD discriminates against women and people of color because it was and non-binary people, because the tests were developed in white boys. So we know that they don't pick up ADHD in other demographics as well. Now, one of the issues with ADHD is that when most people first go to a GP for whatever the problem is, and they don't know it's ADHD, they might go because they've got anxiety, they might go because of a substance use disorder, because they've got a mood disorder. And often, for people with ADHD, often that's not the primary problem. That's something that is secondary to ADHD. Now, if you look at our podcast, it's a really good example of this. The listeners are roughly 50-50 men and women. Plus, we also have, as is common in the neurodivergent community, quite a few non-binary listeners. But if you look at our social media platforms, 80% of our followers are women. Now, this is a conversation that needs to be had, Yinka, and this is why what you do and what people in your space do is so important, because mental health and provision of services is not a zero-sum game. If we support men's mental health, it doesn't mean we have to support women's mental health less. And yet we still have a situation where 3/4 of suicides occur in men. It's the biggest cause of death under the age of 50. And I'm in that 45 to 50 bracket where the peak is. And partly because of social expectations and the kind of masculinity norms that men are socialized with, the stigma and shame, because men will judge other men and men will feel embarrassed at showing vulnerability. These are issues that we need to overcome, because many of the men out there who've got ADHD and its associated mental health issues are not seeking help because, kind of openly standing up and saying, I'm not okay. As I said earlier, I'm not okay, but that's okay, should be the follow-up. We need to learn a way, and it's probably too late for our generation, but to teach our children about the value of mental health, the power of vulnerability, and for men to want to hear from their friends if they're struggling, and to not just want to close it down or to turn it into a joke. And it's a real, I kind of struggle with talking about this again, because as a white man, there are so many demographics that have less support than white males in general in society. But this is one area where actually things really need to change for men in general, because men, are, as any human is, precious. And when I think back particularly, and I know I've spoken about this kind of publicly before, one of the things I struggle with is when people like Keith Flint or Chris Cornell take their own lives, people will often say, oh, why? They had everything, or they seemed so happy. Can you imagine having all that money and not being happy? And I really struggle with this. And I can remember I lost a very close friend when I disclosed to them. I'd worked with them for nearly 15 years. I disclosed to them that I had bipolar and was struggling. And they said, oh, God, cheer up. And I just thought, sorry, what? If I told you I'd broken my leg, you'd be, oh, God, okay, can I do anything for you? Do you need me to come around and mow the garden? But if I say, yeah, I've not been at work for a week because I'm really sad and I can't see any hope and I've got all these, dark thoughts, then other men, even close friends, might not answer messages, don't know what to say or don't want to engage or aren't empowered or skilled to engage in those conversations. And that's what we need to be teaching our children.
100%. Just going back, you mentioned that there was, aside from medication, there was 4 or 5 other ways to support people. What are those ways?
So it's interesting. I'll ask you a question first, Yinka. Have you ever, when you've been given some medication, read the sheet that comes with it, that you have to fold out 22 different ways to get the sheet?
I took was it Ruacatane?
Yeah.
I took that years ago as a kid because of facial scars, etc. And I did read it, and I did realize something about suicidal ideation as well. And I stopped taking it straight away. Whether I know to cease taking it was not a good thing to do, but I did do that. But yes, in answer to your question, I did. But very few people read
Exactly that. And I had similar experience with gabapentin that took it for 3 days and immediately stopped because it weirdly did foster those thoughts. If you read the leaflet for any ADHD medication, it says this medication is not intended to be used on its own and should be used alongside other therapeutic services. So even the people that make the medicine say you shouldn't just use a medicine on its own. Now, in the UK, the government, the NHS's evidence body, NICE, they recommend basically 2 treatment options, and that is medication and therapy. And the therapy they recommend is cognitive behavioral therapy. And their own evidence of its effectiveness is very low. So they say the evidence of the quality of it is very low, but we haven't got anything else, basically. And yet what we know is that psychoeducation works. So if you 100%. Educate people, 100%. For type 2 diabetes, we've got this brilliant scheme called Desmond. When you get diagnosed, you go on a course where you learn about, sugar in foods and taking your blood sugar, all the stuff that's important. We need that for ADHD, and this is something that I'm developing with the NHS now. We know that coaching can be really powerful for the kind of executive function side of things. I'm struggling with prioritizing, I'm struggling with organizing, etc. Therapy is definitely beneficial. As I said, many people will have coexisting mental health conditions or low self-esteem and imposter syndrome or emotional barriers to engaging with work. And equally, there's 2 things which don't get spoken about enough. The first is sleep. So somewhere between 2/3 and 80% of people with ADHD have an issue with sleep, whether it's insomnia, late sleep onset, poor sleep quality, daytime sleepiness. It is basically a sleep disorder. And try getting support for sleep from your GP. If you're under 55, getting hold of even melatonin is difficult. And therefore long-term, and you'll probably be aware of this, CBTI is a program to help people learn how to get into the habit of a healthy sleep hygiene pattern. Should be part of it. And the last thing, and this is fundamentally important, is exercise. Because of all the non-pharmaceutical interventions, the one that probably has the most powerful effect is exercise. During a bout of exercise, focus improves, and afterwards, attention is improved and hyperactivity. So we know that exercise is really powerful. So that the if you like, the gold standard post-diagnostic pathway should be the patient's at the center of a series of decisions. A full psychosocial assessment, like psychosocial needs assessment, should be done. They should be, and medication, therapy, coaching, sleep training, and exercise should all be discussed within a multidisciplinary team to help that person manage their ADHD. And at the minute, what happens is, if you're lucky, you get an assessment. If you get diagnosed, if you're lucky, maybe 12, 18 months later, you'll start medication. And then if you get that, off you pop, out the door, and try and understand what your ADHD is, explain it to other people. Because the medication doesn't fix it. It makes you more functional. It allows you to engage in unrewarding tasks, gives you a bit more motivation, but it doesn't take away ADHD. And therefore, for a lot of people, when they finally get diagnosed and get medicated with the hope that this will not cure them, that's a very dangerous word, but will have a really profound effect, can end up kind of feeling like, well, I'm still struggling with stuff. Well, that's because they're not being managed. Medication isn't enough. It's the path of least resistance to helping somebody.
Yes. You've kind of allayed some of my fears in terms of I been muddling in the dark, as it were. Some of the things you talk about in terms of sleep, in terms of exercise itself, being outdoors. We know these to be therapeutic properties in of themselves anyway. We do know this. I'm not saying it's not rocket science, but it's not rocket science.
But this is the thing, Yinka, as an ex-scientist who's very frustrated at the lag between evidence and medical practice. As you say, we know these things. We know as you say, we know the impact of spending time in a green area, is as powerful, more powerful than most of the antidepressants on the market for mood. We know the impact of exercise goes far beyond weight and cardiorespiratory fitness. And there are some areas and schemes where people will be prescribed exercise, where there are, third sector organisations that will help people, go out and spend time in the countryside.
Yes.
But we haven't got, we've got an approach where, as again, and I'm not knocking GPs because they have 10 minutes to see someone who might come in saying, I'm anxious, I'm depressed, and it's just easy to give them sertraline or citalopram and say, there you go, try this, come back in 4 weeks. Because the GPs will know that there aren't any other services. If you're lucky, in your local area through IAPT, which is a scheme where you can self-refer for therapy, there may be 4 or 5 providers, but the therapy they provide will probably be limited to CBT. You might find the odd kind of integrated therapist, but it's difficult. And GPs know this. In fact, psychiatrists know this. My bipolar psychiatrist, who I last saw in September, and we discussed what happened in May, the difficulties I'd had, just looked at me at the end and shook her head and said, there's not really anything I can do. I can't refer you to anybody for therapy. She said, just carry on taking the medication. And I felt sorry for her. I thought, God, it must be difficult for you sitting there having people with real challenges sat in front of you, and the only tool you've got is, well, here's some medication. Because we don't have sufficient services for people to access them. And
joined up, you alluded to social prescribing, etc. We know that's, we're starting to see that. I'm seeing that a little bit in GPs practices here in Liverpool, and it makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, it to have, community hubs where you can see the breadth of things that can help people being employed. And the medical model which we have in the UK, which is old-fashioned, isn't working. And I'm not saying scrap the NHS. I'm a huge fan of the NHS, but having, this discrepancy between primary care and secondary care, where money is being, particularly spent on where there are targets, as you could understand, A&E and ambulance waits, but not on mental health, for example, where we've got interventions. And so many therapists out there who are so skilled and talented and can help so many people, and are having to set up as a self-employed therapist, offering their services, to people who have the money to pay or have insurance schemes. For many people, particularly people affected by mental health issues, they can't afford to pay however much it might be per hour for a session every 2 weeks for 12 weeks, and therefore they don't. In fact, when I started my IFS therapy, I did it as a quid pro quo, and I coached that person because I couldn't afford therapy. And it worked in that we would switch every other week, and I would do a coaching session and then she would do a therapy session. But other than that, and the situation I'm in now, my wife, bless her, keeps on saying, maybe you should consider therapy. And I just can't afford it. Where it shouldn't be a luxury, Yinka. Therapy shouldn't be a luxury.
My take on, as a therapist, it should be a bit like the England cricket team, centralised.
Yeah.
Therapists are centralised, so anybody who needs it can access it at the point of need.
Yeah.
And that our wages are taken care of,
The most difficult part of my job, of all the things that I do, as the chair of the charity, the most difficult part of my job is when I receive a letter telling us we've had a cheque for £1,000 donated from the parents of a young person with ADHD that took their own life. And reading that letter every time devastates me. And I really struggle to write a reply, obviously, just because thinking about that person. Now, if somebody can explain to me, anybody can explain to me why a mental health crisis is less serious than chest pain, which isn't a heart attack, or less serious than the whole number of physical health conditions, which are kind of higher up the chain of priority, and where you will get help from somebody, at the point of need for everybody. Why mental health doesn't have that?
I don't get that. We know that one death by suicide equates to 1.67 million. We have 6,500 deaths each year in the United Kingdom. And it's like, do the maths. the impact, the ripple effect is one death it impacts a minimum of 135 people.
Yeah.
Those people are in a high risk category group themselves.
Yeah.
As a result of that, the loss of a loved one.
Can you remember any point in the last, 10 years, 20 years, where anything more than kind of piecemeal offerings or policies have been announced by any government of any colour, of any flavour, when it comes to mental health? We're going to invest £3 billion over the next Parliament, over the entirety of 5 years in mental health services.
It's quite funny you should ask that question, because I think it was Keir Starmer mentioned we're going to invest £10 million in mental health provision. The maths on that, save 6 people from suicide.
Yeah, this is the thing. I'm not sure if you're aware of roughly what the NHS budget is, but it's around £128 billion a year, the cost of the NHS. And if you look at the numbers they're talking about in terms of investment in mental health services, you're looking at about 2 weeks worth of, maybe a week or 2 weeks worth of what it costs to run the NHS. And it fundamentally misunderstands the point that to have a psychiatrist at the point where they're a consultant obviously takes a long time to train them.
Yes.
To have therapists who've got sufficient experience so that they can deal with these complex cases, it takes a long time to train them. Yes. And, going to university is now expensive, and the stress that people within the NHS, workers within the NHS, have to face is very real. And empty promises of investing money, which every government makes, without real action, without measurable outcomes, saying, well, we want, in 3 years' time, we want to be able to say that the suicide rate has dropped by X%. We want to be able to say that everybody that has a mental health issue gets seen within X amount of weeks. Those promises never get made.
No, they don't.
And of the people I know who've taken their lives or attempted to, of the people I know with significant mental health crises or issues rather, I would say all of them, pretty much all of them, have to self-manage their mental health issues. Some of them are under the care of a psychiatrist, and some of them are medicated, but it's largely about kind of dealing with it on your own, because there's not much else out there, and that's a crime in 2025.
James, I would so love to have you back on air again.
Anytime, mate.
I feel we've just scratched the surface. I'm not looking to create a new podcast with you or anything like that, but there's so much information that is invaluable, not only to me, but I'm sure to our listeners as well. What keeps you up at night?
It's a good question. Partly because obviously with ADHD, there's a lot of nights where I'm up. This is going to sound dark, and I think I might have to explain it. There is part of me, Yinka, that has accepted that at some point in my life, I will be the person who chooses to end my life. And that's not a plan. It's not a desire. It's just an acceptance that I, rather than becoming old and frail and alone, would rather be in control of my destiny. So I have no fear of mortality. I have no fear of, whether there's an afterlife or not. So the big kind of existential philosophical questions that people often have that keep them up at night, I don't. The things that keep me up at night are often, I see myself as a fixer, very much as a fixer. So if somebody's got a problem, I want to help them, and I often think I can't help them. Not being able to fix things, help people, that's the stuff that keeps me up at night. When I hear of a friend that's really struggling because of their mental health, and there's little I can pragmatically do, but I'm still thinking about them, that keeps me up. When my wife is struggling and I can see that she's struggling, and even when we talk about it and I know that I can't fix it, that keeps me up at night. It's almost a frustration that I don't have that magic button to say, I want to take your problems away because you don't deserve to have them. And that's what keeps me up, is that frustration. I think that I can't fix everything, which I know is ridiculous, but that's in my head. I very much see myself as a fixer.
Thank you. Just one last question. It just popped into my head now. you're having dinner. There's 8 people. Aside from yourself, name 7 other people who are going to sit around the table with you. Past and present.
Oh my God. Past and present. Okay.
I'll give you a little bit of time to think about that.
No, I reckon I can do this quickly, but I'll forget numbers. I'd have to have my wife there because she is the life and soul of the party and the funniest person I know.
Okay.
Second person I would have is a guy called Sir George Still, and he's the first British physician to write about ADHD in 1902, and he called it an abnormal defect of moral control in children. And I'd like to have him at that meal because I'd like to set him straight on one or two things. Collectively, as one guest, I would like to invite all of the right-wing polemicist op-ed writers who over the last couple of years have written pieces like ADHD isn't real. If you just put your phones down, you wouldn't have ADHD. I'm not a doctor, but I can tell you you've probably got ADHD. I'd like all of them there as one person in a queue for the same reason, so I can set them straight. So that's 3. I would like Muhammad Ali to be there because he's the greatest athlete that's ever lived. I would like Steven Gerrard to be there because he's the greatest midfielder that's ever been. I'm up to 5. I would like my dad to be there because obviously he's my dad. And I would like the last seat to be empty. And there's a reason for that. Because that last seat is there for everybody that could have been there, that should have been there, that deserved to be there.
Stop it. Spot on.
So there's my 7.
Stop it. That's brilliant. I've never thought about asking that as a question, but I don't know how anybody's going to top that.
It's yeah. Often I don't think about things and they just come out, but as soon as I got past Muhammad Ali, it was easy, mate.
James Brown, you've been a brilliant guest on The Hurt Locker. Thank you so much.
Can I, this is really important to me, can I thank you? Because I didn't expect to be talking about my dad, and I didn't expect to have what to me is a beautiful opportunity to take a few seconds to close my eyes and think about what he meant to me. And I wouldn't have had that without you. So thank you, Yinka. That's been a very important thing for me.
Thank you. Stay blessed. The Hurt Locker is a safe space for our guests to openly share their mental health experiences. If you have been affected by any of the content in this recording, then please reach out for support. If it is an emergency, dial 999. If you would like to talk to somebody today, then please call the Samaritans on 116 123. Stay safe. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Hurt Locker. Please give us a rating or share with another listener. You can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook at The Hurt Locker Pod.